Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the session on approaches to evaluation during the pandemic. Thank you also for colleagues who are joining online. I hope you enjoy the session. In this session, we will consider how evaluation adapted to the pandemic and ensure continuity and informed decision-making, and what lessons and approaches were learned that should be taken forward for evaluation in general. As we know, the pandemic led to a considerable shift in how we undertook evaluations, and often in the methodological approaches, as well as in the tools we use to implement our evaluations. This conference, of course, is about national evaluation systems and resilience. And as a result, we must look at our most recent response to the crisis, COVID-19 and the pandemic, including the concerted efforts and approaches undertaken during the pandemic, to learn from them. However, I would also like us to consider what is being taken forward beyond the pandemic. What have we learned? What are we going to embed in our practices? What lessons do we have and approaches that are being incorporated into our everyday evaluative thinking? So I'm Richard Jones. Sorry, I should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm the Chief of Section for Capacity Development at the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP, based in New York. I was also our COVID-19 focal point during the last 2 years, and worked very closely with some of you in this room through the coalition, the COVID-19 coalition, also with some of you through UNEG and UN agency coordination for the pandemic. We pivoted. I think that's one of the words you hear a lot. We pivoted. Everybody pivoted in March 2020. We pivoted quickly. We produced guidance that was initially for the first 3 months of the pandemic, because we didn't know how long it was going to take, the pandemic would take to get over. So in March, we produced guidance for the organization, and as an underpinning of that guidance was doing no harm. So placing nobody in harm or in danger of getting COVID-19. We had to do all our evaluations remotely, like the rest, like all of us. We broadened our desk reviews. We started doing remote interviews. So what would have taken 2 to 3 weeks ended up taking 2 to 3 months in some cases. But we Zoomed, we used WhatsApp, and we used greater use of national evaluators where it was possible, with a consideration to not doing any harm. We also produced a series of synthesis reports that were built on over 5,000 evaluations that UNDP had done in general, many on previous crises, such as the Ebola in West Africa, as far back as the tsunami in 2005. We produced those to grab lessons that could quickly be given to the organization to help to influence how it would respond to the crisis. We also created a number of new partnerships. So we strengthened partnerships with the OECD, with the COVID Coalition, with UNEG and others, and shameless self-promotion. We also then did an evaluation of partly UNDP's response to COVID-19. And this was started back in January 2021, where we were still very much in the midst of the crisis. But we took more of a formative approach, and that was the first time we had done a formative evaluation. I think many organizations did real-time or formative evaluations to try and influence or give lessons to direct strategies going forward. And that's what we did with this evaluation, which was completed earlier this year. But what did we take forward, and what has changed our work? We continued reflections, we're still doing Zoom interviews, but we're now back in the field as well. This is central to this panel discussion today, what we're taking forward. We have an esteemed panel here, but we also want to hear from you, what you did, what lessons you learnt, and how you've changed the way you do your work as evaluators. So firstly, entirely on my left, sorry, we have Santiago Rodriguez, who's an evaluation analyst with the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. And he will introduce the work they did on triangulating methods for evaluation and learning and examples of early evaluation of COVID-19 response. This will be followed by Bai, a coordinator of the South Socioeconomic Impact Monitoring Unit and in the Operational Office for Monitoring and Emerging Senegal Plan, obviously from Senegal. And he will discuss, or he will showcase the work that they did looking at how mobile data can help fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, finally but not least, sorry, is Jenna Smith-Kwasi. Sorry, is that right? Kwasi? An evaluation policy analyst at the OECD, who will reflect on the work that the COVID-19 Coalition has done over the last 2.5 years and give us an overview of the new and emerging evaluative trends that are being seen through that partnership. The coalition is something we've been strongly involved in as well, and we work very closely with Jenna and Megan and the team. And it's been an excellent experience to track who's doing what, and a really good sharing and learning experience where we can learn from each other. So we have 3 presentations, which will take 25 to 30 minutes and some questions. But really, I'd also urge you to start to think about what you can offer us as well, because I want to throw it back to you and see what lessons you have coming out and what is resonating here from the panel as well. So please.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction, Richard, and for together with the UNDP, the whole conference organizers, and IEG, who gave me the opportunity to showcase this triangulating of methods in the recent COVID-19 evaluation, has given me the opportunity to be here and showcase this important work. To me, it's a great privilege to be here and in this panel and in front of this great audience. And so I will just run 3 quick introductory remarks before I begin the presentation. So just to set the stage. So first, is just to briefly mention the role of the independent evaluation groups where I work, which is to evaluate the development effectiveness of the World Bank Group for it to deliver better services and results to its clients. It does so by generating lessons from past experience, and thus it implies work through ex-post evaluations. Also, accountability to shareholders and stakeholders at large through this work is done by IEG. IEG is independent of the management of the World Bank Group and reports directly to the Executive Board of Directors. And that's the first point. The second is that in February 2020, the World Bank Group launched a large-scale response to the health, social, and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was aligned with the global actions from the World Health Organization and other organizations. The response consisted of $160 billion in financial commitments for fiscal years 2020 and 2021. The World Bank, the fiscal years run from July 1 to June 30. And the response covered 3 stages: relief, restructuring, and recovery, to which I will return later, but for now you can just think of them as being sequential, and 4 pillars or broad areas of intervention support. The first one, saving lives or health. The second one, protecting the poor and vulnerable. The third one, ensuring sustainable business growth and job creation, or the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the institutional strengthening for recovery. Third, I just like to provide a quick definition of triangulation, because we're going to be talking about that in this presentation. So here we understand triangulation as the cross-referencing of data and evidence between methods to enhance analysis, to validate findings, to deepen understanding, and to answer evaluation questions. So I'll just say one more time because it seems like it has a lot in there. So triangulation is a cross-referencing of data and evidence between methods to enhance analysis, validate findings, deepen understanding, and answer evaluation questions. I'm trying to change slides. Thank you. So against this backdrop, this evaluations focuses on the pillars of health, social response, and institutional strengthening as it relates to the health and social response, because institutional strengthening also has a component that is related to the economic implications of COVID-19, but that actually is covered by a separate evaluation that IEG also undertook, but it's not covered by the one that we're going to present here. The evaluation sought to assess the quality of the World Bank's COVID-19 response during the first 15 months of the pandemic. It was thus an early assessment of the response to learn about what the World Bank was doing and to extract lessons to inform ongoing work and the future support for crisis preparedness and response. The evaluation focused on answering 3 questions, which you can see in the bottom right of the slide. One on relevance, the World Bank support to country needs in health and social areas. A second one on the factors that facilitated or hindered implementation of this support. And a third one on how well World Bank operational policies and partnerships work to facilitate the response. The evaluation also focused on the assessment on the early relief and early restructuring stages that I mentioned previously, which as I mentioned, you can think of them as being sequential. Next slide, please. I did something. So here, I mean, you can't, it's very small, but here what we have is the actual framework developed by the World Bank as it relates to the evaluation. The framework of the World Bank's COVID-19 response. So you can see the relief and restructuring stages at the center, since they are covered by the evaluation. You can see their names at the top, colored blue and orange boxes. And you can see the recovery stage at the bottom in the green box, since it was left out. So it's really just an add-on to the framework right at this point. And the thematic areas to the left, which are mapped to the pillars that I mentioned previously that apply to the focus of the health and social response. And at the intersection, all that small text that we see there, we see the types of results that are expected at each stage of the response to the health threat and to protect human capital, from early outputs in the relief stage to intermediate outcomes and later outcomes, all the way through to the restructuring and across to the recovery stages. So I won't go over all of that intersection content for now, but just to show a few examples. So some expected results for the health services, which would be like the first category in the dark blue box to the left, going from up down. So the first, assuring health services. So expected results for that area will be, for example, assuring critical health services like infection prevention, control and surveillance, case management, and support to essential health services like primary care and maternal and child health. And later in the restructuring stage, the strengthening of health systems and the strength of the restructuring systems. Similarly, for social protection, we see the poor and protecting the poor and vulnerable through cash transfers and assuring targeted income and in-kind support at the relief stage, and then at the restructuring stage, again, strengthening social protection systems. Again, for education or child welfare, we see assuring continued learning at the relief stage, and then making sure that children return to school at the restructuring stage. Institutional strengthening is improved coordination, and then just developing more sound policy and financing systems to manage crisis in the future. So this is a theory of action. The main let's say, foundation of the evaluation is the conceptual framework, but the theory of action complements it quite well because it outlines the different dimensions of the assessment that are actually mapped to the evaluation questions. So you see, for example, the relevance question is on the top left dark blue section of the diagram. And again, it lists some of the dimensions there in very small font, and I won't go too much in detail into the dimensions, but just mention a few examples where it says based on needs, we're asking, okay, what has the World Bank's response or support to health and social needs of countries being consistent with the needs of countries, right? Is that support building on capacities that were seen previously in the countries in terms of existing networks, for example, for nutrition or for other elements of human capital, and were the interventions of the World Bank aligned with the national plans that in turn were guided by the World Health Organization. And also we have something called reorientation of the portfolio, which will become important, and it's simply the amount of projects that were either newly designed for the pandemic to respond to the pandemic, or that were already active and were repurposed to address the pandemic. In terms of the implementation block, the World Bank has data on implementation ratings for each project that are updated while the projects are active. So we use that to assess factors behind implementation success. We looked at the implementation status or progress of the response through these ratings. We also asked if the World Bank was anchoring its support in lessons of evidence from past crises, among other things. So now we arrive at the design matrix, and here we actually see the method, it shows the actual methods that we're going to talk about and illustrates the triangulation of data. So there were at least 7 methods that you see in the central block, in the central part of the diagram, that where triangulation was very important. And one of them in particular, which you see at the portfolio level, methods are divided by country level, portfolio level, and corporate level analysis. So there's 3 different levels. But the portfolio review that you see in the center was quite important because it consisted of generating project characteristics relevant to the COVID-19 response by the World Bank, and it fed or provided inputs for all the other methods in the top of the diagram. And so here we will arrive to the lesson, but here having a central method that provides information to all the others helps with efficiency, helps to triangulate information and to triangulate findings and make sense of what's going on. So I'm just going to go over each of the methods, not very quickly, but I'm going to integrate it with what I said about the portfolio. So for example, with country case studies, the project information for each country was key for the analysis in combination with information from remote interviews with World Bank staff, government, and civil society. In the heat map, it's just a ranking of country needs across areas of the conceptual framework based on country level indicators that we extracted from multiple sources, including informed databases, international health regulations, and others. Project information allowed to assess the relevance of the World Bank support to country needs through this heat map. So we had the country level indicators highlighting the needs, and then the interventions by the World Bank through the projects. We compare them and assess whether the World Bank was addressing the needs or whether they weren't. It's done.
No, you keep going, but just so you're
Okay.
aware.
Okay, so here I just want to highlight that. And then there were other methods like the literature review and regional project review, which also integrated project information. And so the point being there that all these methods integrated this information and produced findings that could later be triangulated. So I'll just go over this quickly. This just shows the triangulation of findings. What we show here is just that several methods uncovered gaps to needs. That's the first block to the left. In the second block, a lot of methods showed or identified factors relevant for implementing or for successful implementation of projects, including monitoring and evaluation, multi-sectoral coordination, and others. And the third block is more corporate or more internal bank processes, but it showed portfolio analysis and other methods show that the varying the financing instruments of the World Bank made the interventions or the response more quick. So very quickly, the challenges. So the main point being, I don't want to go too much in detail into the text, but basically the challenges are that well, the pandemic created challenges because internally created opportunities or a silver lining about the pandemic. So what we're trying to say is that the response forced the evaluation team to provide ongoing feedback on findings to the teams on the field, because it was the pandemic was dynamic, created a dynamic situation in which teams on the field needed to get information that was useful for them to adapt their implementation. This was a challenge for the evaluation, and it created delays, but it also created an opportunity, or what we call a silver lining, for enhancing the triangulation of methods with the remote interviews, with different methods that were introduced, like identifying innovations from portfolio review and different sources within the World Bank that benefited the implementation of the project. And so what we see here is that remote, where we can draw about maybe two lessons that are not concretely written there, but the challenges create two things that are important. In general, remote interviews became the norm with COVID and generated more interviews compared to what previous evaluation would probably have done if we were just doing interviews in the field. Second, the portfolio review, or more generally, anything that has to do with text-based analytics in other evaluations, not at the World Bank, probably can become a central source of information for other methods. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I mean, it's difficult when you have spent so much. That maybe I could ask you, I mean, in a way, we triangulation is something we talk about a lot when we do our evaluations, pre-pandemic, especially. During the pandemic, it became key. So how was the methodology that you took? How did it strike you as being different to the way you were doing it previously? And then, is this being taken forward in a minute or so?
So I think regardless of whether there had been a pandemic or not, all of these methods would have been implemented. So what I was saying is that even if the pandemic had not occurred, all of these methods would probably have been implemented because they help to enhance the analysis. But what the pandemic did was bring to the center the concept of triangulation. So it was not only triangulation among the existing methods, but also with the new, let's call them methods that were, forced by the pandemic, like remote interviews, and the absence, you couldn't build rapport with the client on the field, and there might have been some bias in the sample selection, all of that. But what happened was that when you triangulated evidence, you could bring information or collate information from different sources, and that I think has to be rescued going forward for other crisis evaluations.
Just for crisis?
No, well, for all, but since we're talking about COVID, I think any other crisis could also be, it could apply to that as well. Sorry, you asked something else.
Thank you. Thank you, Santiago. Bye. I'd like to pass over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Richard. Je voudrais d'abord remercier Richard, les organisateurs, pour nous avoir donné l'opportunité de partager notre expérience aujourd'hui avec vous. Je m'appelle Baye Eliman Gueye, je suis le coordonnateur du pôle suivi des impacts socio-économiques au bureau opérationnel de suivi du plan Sénégal émergent, qui est la delivery unit du Sénégal en matière de projets et réformes phares. Nous avons voulu nous intéresser aujourd'hui à ce thème et travailler sur l'utilisation des données mobiles parce que, comme vous le savez très bien, la pandémie a démarré dans une localité et elle s'est propagée dans le monde à partir des déplacements de population. Et aujourd'hui, le plus important pour nous, c'est de pouvoir partir de la situation que nous avions vécue pendant la COVID et essayer de nous projeter dans l'avenir et essayer de trouver un lien de causalité entre les déplacements des populations et le nombre de cas de COVID-19 que nous avions. Pour bien vous mettre en perspective, je pense qu'il est important de pouvoir regarder la panoplie de mesures qui ont été prises par le Sénégal après l'avènement du premier cas. Donc, notre premier cas, Nous l'avions eu au mois de mars, précisément le 2, et le gouvernement a commencé à prendre des mesures pour contrecarrer la pandémie le 23 mars 2020, ce qui fait une différence en termes de jours d'au moins 20 jours, parce que le cabinet d'Alberg a pu réaliser une étude pour comparer en tout cas les interventions entre les différents pays dans le monde. Et il est ressorti de ce travail que 49% des États ont pris des mesures dans les 3 semaines qui ont suivi le premier cas. Et donc, le Sénégal s'est trouvé dans cette perspective-là. Et on a pris des mesures fortes pour faire des restrictions sur les déplacements des populations avec le couvre-feu, avec la fermeture des écoles, des universités, mais aussi la fermeture des lieux de culte. Ça, quand même, c'est une décision très forte au Sénégal et beaucoup de restrictions dans le domaine du transport. Le 11 mai, on a commencé à prendre des réaménagements et à partir du mois de juin, le gouvernement a décidé d'assouplir les mesures. Donc, vous voyez que sur cette timeline-là, entre mars et juin, on a pris de fortes mesures et à la fin, on a commencé à prendre des mesures d'assouplissement, alors que même la pandémie ne connaissait pas un niveau d'évolution très, très important. Les mesures ont eu des conséquences très fortes sur la population et la première enquête qui a été réalisée a été faite par Nestor Moscovitz de l'université d'Oxford, qui ont essayé de faire une enquête pour voir les pertes de revenus au niveau des ménages. Et vous voyez, il y a 87% des ménages qui ont perdu des revenus pendant cette phase de restriction. Ensuite, ces restrictions ont été beaucoup plus importantes, en tout cas ont eu des conséquences beaucoup plus importantes au niveau des populations du monde rural, parce que le Sénégal est un pays où il y a une forte communauté qui vit à l'étranger. Et pendant les périodes de confinement, ces baisses de revenus enregistrées pour les Sénégalais de l'extérieur ont eu des conséquences sur les transferts aux ménages. Et il fallait pour le gouvernement réagir. Et dans cette réaction-là, nous avons adopté la même méthode que Santiago a présentée avec la Banque mondiale, c'est-à-dire de mettre en place un programme de résilience économique et sociale qui consistait d'abord à renforcer le système sanitaire par l'augmentation du nombre de lits, mais aussi à renforcer la stabilité macroéconomique avec des mesures d'ordre fiscal pour permettre aux entreprises de bien fonctionner, mais aussi il y avait toujours cette question de renforcement de la résilience sociale des ménages avec les aides que l'État a pu faire. Donc, il fallait trouver une solution. Donc, l'État a organisé les chercheurs, l'administration, la société civile en une task force pour essayer de réfléchir sur comment aujourd'hui aider le gouvernement à prendre les meilleures décisions. Parce qu'il y a deux notions qui se ressemblent mais qui sont assez différentes. Est-ce que j'ai pris la bonne décision avant de prendre cette décision ou est-ce que la décision que j'ai prise était la bonne? Il y a une nuance et l'objectif de cette task force-là, c'était d'aider le gouvernement à prendre les meilleures mesures. Et nous nous sommes rendus compte qu'il y avait une alternative par rapport aux méthodologies qu'on utilisait, notamment les modèles compartimentaux que tous les pays ont utilisés pour faire la prévision des pics, la prévision du nombre de cas. Il y avait l'utilisation des données mobiles pour voir comment les populations ont réagi par rapport aux mesures que l'État a organisées. Et il y a Google Mobility Report qui a eu en tout cas l'idée de mettre à disposition des chercheurs, des États et de toute personne qui était intéressée à manipuler ces données, une panoplie de données. Et ces données ont été recueillies sur la base de la localisation des personnes. Et ce qui nous intéressait, nous, c'est de le mettre en application dans le cadre du Sénégal et de prendre les 6 lieux les plus fréquents, les plus utilisés par les populations. Il s'agit des lieux de loisirs, les shoppings, les lieux de travail, mais aussi il y avait le transport, les parcs publics et les déplacements vers les lieux de résidence. Ces 6 déplacements clés qui intéressent le Sénégal, parce que le Sénégal est un pays fortement tiré par le secteur tertiaire. Et quand vous voyez ces secteurs-là, ces déplacements dans ces lieux-là, c'est des lieux où il y a une forte, en tout cas, prédominance de services, et ce qui fait que nous allons nous intéresser à ces 6 secteurs. Et l'objectif, c'est de défiler aujourd'hui, de voir comment le Sénégal a réagi, comment les populations ont réagi par rapport à ces restrictions. Vous voyez sur ces types de graphiques, il y en a 6, vous voyez que c'est le Sénégal qui est en vert. Et on a essayé de le comparer avec les 8 pays de l'UEMOA. Et pendant toute cette période, le Sénégal est le pays qui a le plus fortement réagi à la baisse dans ces déplacements-là. Donc, on a moins 50% de déplacements dans les lieux de commerce et loisirs. Mais ici, le plus important, c'est qu'il y a la notion d'anticipation. Donc, la population a anticipé leur déplacement bien avant que le gouvernement ne prenne les mesures de restriction. Et ça, c'est un élément important quand on veut lutter contre ce type de phénomène. Ensuite, il y a les déplacements même vers les pharmacies, les alimentations, moins 35%, moins 40% dans les lieux publics, moins 60% dans les arrêts de bus, moins 35% dans les lieux de travail, mais surtout le plus important, c'est quand vous n'allez pas travailler, c'est le temps de présence dans les maisons qui augmente. Et donc ça, c'est pas acceptable pour un pays comme le Sénégal qui est assez vulnérable. Il faut que l'activité économique puisse reprendre. Et ce que nous avons essayé de faire, c'est d'utiliser un modèle économétrique pour étudier le lien entre les déplacements vers ces lieux et le nombre de cas de COVID-19. Et en conclusion, nous avons tiré qu'il y a 3 lieux où on peut mettre des mesures barrières et on peut les considérer comme des lieux les plus sûrs, en tout cas dans le cas du Sénégal, et 3 types de lieux également qui posent le plus de problèmes. Il s'agit des places publiques, il s'agit des loisirs, il s'agit des lieux de travail, et je pense que dans tous les pays du monde, les déplacements vers les lieux publics ont subi de fortes restrictions. Et c'est ce que nous avons voulu montrer à l'État. Au lieu de fermer toute l'activité économique, on pouvait se concentrer sur certains secteurs, mettre en place des mesures barrières, mettre en place des restrictions et laisser les autres secteurs fonctionner, parce que dans les supermarchés, les arrêts de bus à domicile, on peut bien mettre la distanciation, on peut bien mettre le masque et on peut respecter les mesures barrières dans ces lieux. En perspective, et cette question-là, je pense que je vais y répondre tout à l'heure lors des discussions, si vous voulez utiliser les données mobiles dans le cadre de ces travaux-là pour essayer de capter l'impact de la pandémie ou les déplacements des populations, il y a 3 questions importantes à prendre en considération. Il y a l'accès aux données, c'est un facteur très important, ce n'est pas toujours accessible, c'est difficile. Il y a le problème de l'anonymisation quand vous utilisez les données mobiles, mais surtout le financement, parce que c'est des milliards de données qu'il va falloir stocker quelque part. Il va nécessiter une infrastructure qui va permettre de collecter tout ça. Sur ce, je vous remercie de votre aimable attention. J'espère que j'ai tenu sur 7 à 10 minutes comme Richard avait demandé. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Bai. That's fascinating. So I'm interested to know, do you have a plan to use that data or a strategy of how that data will be used, or a similar approach will be used either for other health impacts or for other things?
Merci beaucoup, Richard, pour cette question est très importante, et j'avoue que nous n'en sommes pas restés là à ce niveau. La semaine dernière, il y a 2 semaines, nous étions à Paris pour une mission de benchmark sur l'intelligence artificielle. Et je pense que le gouvernement du Sénégal est dans des dispositions pour aller plus loin et pouvoir prévenir les prochains chocs que le monde pourrait subir dans le futur. Et notre objectif, c'est aujourd'hui de signer un partenariat avec le plus grand opérateur de téléphonie mobile du Sénégal pour obtenir les données que nous voulons, pour essayer d'en comprendre un peu plus sur la pandémie, les déplacements, et les mettre en corrélation avec le nombre de cas de COVID-19 enregistrés. Deuxièmement, c'est de pouvoir essayer d'utiliser l'intelligence artificielle pour voir comment, dans le futur, le Sénégal pourrait réagir de manière à ce qu'on puisse maintenir l'activité économique tout en permettant de lutter contre cette pandémie. Et au mois de mars 2023, nous comptons organiser une conférence sur l'intelligence artificielle pour poser ces questions et surtout poser le débat sur l'utilisation des données mobiles, parce que nous l'avons déjà utilisé dans le cadre du transport pour essayer de voir comment on peut planifier nos infrastructures de transport. Nous sommes en train également de travailler sur la question de l'énergie avec la priorisation de l'accès à l'électricité dans le monde rural, mais surtout aussi le suivi des stocks au niveau des produits agricoles. Donc, nous sommes vraiment dans la marche, en tout cas, pour développer l'usage de ces données mobiles et essayer d'aider l'État à mieux prendre les décisions qu'il faut. Merci.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we've come at this from two different directions. We've got how we've adapted our evaluative approach and how we've implemented new tools and new data gathering tools to influence not just our evaluations. And I like the idea that, you know, it wasn't so much to influence evaluations, it was targeted at policy. It was very much linked through to policy, and that we're taking that forward. Jenna, you've had a very sort of broad view, as if you like, of many countries, and we're very interested to see what the coalition has picked up and how this may have resonated with what you've seen.
Hello, colleagues. Good afternoon. Thank you, Richard, first of all, for having me on this panel. Thank you to my fellow panelists for their excellent presentations. And thank you to all of you for being here, not only at this session, but at the conference in general. I find having these opportunities to learn from each other, they're extremely enriching, and being able to do so in person is definitely not something that I take for granted. So thank you. So I'm just going to complement your introduction very quickly, Richard, I promise. I'm a policy analyst with the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Our team, the evaluation unit, is the secretariat for the OECD Development Assistance Committee Network on Development Evaluation, which is also known as EvalNet, and that's how I'll refer to the network throughout my presentation. We're also the secretariat, as Richard mentioned, for the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition, which is essentially, it's an independent collaborative project of EvalNet, but it brings together countries, so both OECD and non-OECD countries. It's open to all countries, as well as multilateral organizations and UN agencies, all of whom have an interest in evaluating COVID-19 response and recovery efforts. So prior to joining the OECD in 2021, I was an evaluator with the Government of Canada. Specifically, I've worked with Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada and with Global Affairs Canada. All of that to say that in addition to having my finger on the pulse of the adaptations that are being made broadly, I also do have experience evaluating in the context of COVID-19 as well. I think I might have the wrong clicker. Sorry. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so how did EvalNet members adapt to the pandemic? So EvalNet members requested support at the onset of the pandemic to really adapt their ways of working, ensure continuity, and to inform policy and decision making. In early 2021, an EvalNet meeting was held with the sole purpose really of learning and adapting and working in the context of COVID-19 and just discussing our experiences. During this time, our team also compiled the initial reflections of EvalNet members and the adaptations highlighted in these exercises, and really what we've seen across the board, can be grouped into three broad categories. So number one, through transformed relationships with program stakeholders and decision makers. Two, by rethinking how evaluative evidence is gathered and communicated. And three, by increasing communication, coordination, and collaboration across the global evaluation community. Sorry, guys. So I'll just start. I'm stating the obvious here, but the learning and accountability needs related to COVID-19 were acute. They were significant. And in a context where policy and decision makers and program staff were really working under unprecedented circumstances and with thinly stretched resources, the need for timely, credible evidence was higher than ever before. So COVID-19 really brought the imperative of changing how evaluation units work and engage with policymakers, with program staff, with beneficiaries. Evaluation units responded by working carefully and constructively with these stakeholders, and at different times, often much earlier in the process than previously, and in new capacities. And this really highlighted the importance of soft skills of evaluating, especially with respect to relationship building and facilitation skills. These skills were important for ensuring that activity is useful, but also for ensuring that it promotes evaluative activity, promote utilization. So evaluations units worked with program staff to better tailor their activities to organizational needs, and also to develop timelines and work plans that really reflected organizations' views on the appropriate balance between timeliness on one hand and rigor on the other. A huge adaptation was not letting perfection be the enemy, not letting perfection be the enemy of the good. So what do I mean by that? COVID-19, previously, evaluation findings, recommendations, conclusions, they were shared when they were nearly perfected. And the pandemic didn't allow for that. We really had to present what we had in the state that it was in when it was needed. And this was in order to really inject evaluative evidence into policy or decision-making discussions. And I think that this really pushed evaluators out of their comfort zone. And I speak from experience here because it definitely did push me out of my comfort zone. We go to there. Oh, it's working. Okay, so this second part here, rethinking how evaluative evidence is gathered and communicated, is very much related to and in response to the first point. There's a whole rethinking around how and when evaluative evidence is gathered and communicated. There's a great deal of flexibility in adjusting evaluation plans and approaches. Evaluations were prioritized, then reprioritized. They were postponed, conducted remotely, or as a desk review. They were conducted with adjusted timelines, and in some cases, they were canceled. Some organizations also adapted by embedding COVID-19 related questions into ongoing evaluations. Evaluation units sought out and learned new systems, adapted existing instruments, and improved models of online engagement. There was also a much stronger reliance on digital data collection methods, as we've seen. We saw an increase in the use of electronic surveys, virtual interviews. With international travel and field visits halted, we noticed a stronger emphasis on document review, which may have been a bit less prominent prior to the pandemic. We also saw organizations capitalizing on the use of existing administrative data, often in new or creative ways. There's also a greater emphasis on the use of learning-oriented approaches and products. So the strong demand for evidence and in real time saw EvalNet members develop syntheses of past evaluations at the onset of the pandemic. So looking at, again, Ebola, as Richard mentioned, or the financial crises to respond to information needs at the onset. There was also an increase in the use of real-time evaluations as the pandemic evolved to provide immediate feedback to program staff and to decision makers. And finally, EvalNet members disseminated findings and learning in new and creative ways. So for example, throughout the pandemic, there was an increase in the use of shorter, more digestible lessons learned type documents, in the use of infographics, webinars, and well-structured briefs and syntheses. I think that we've also started using social media more frequently and perhaps more strategically to disseminate key messages and in real time. Okay, perfect. Finally, there was an increase in communication, coordination, and collaboration across the global evaluation community. With international evaluators unable to travel, of course, there's been a much greater reliance on national evaluators and consultants. In some cases, they've taken the lead entirely, and in other cases, national teams have been supported remotely by international evaluators, so more of a hybrid approach. Sometimes this has been done in a mentoring capacity, but overall, national consultants have been given a much greater responsibility as a result of COVID-19. In discussions, EvalNet members really emphasized the importance of the do no harm principle here and shared steps that were taken to ensure that the risk wasn't simply transferred from the international evaluators onto the national evaluators and having them out in the field. Many EvalNet members actually had partnerships with local evaluators pre-pandemic, and these experiences in both designing and implementing hybrid approaches with their evaluation teams. And these lessons and experiences were really invaluable for sharing with other EvalNet members as we adapted. Final point on this slide is that the pandemic demonstrated the benefits of sharing information, of sharing lessons, of sharing practices across organizations. And it also confirmed the importance of inclusion and of not just working, with OECD countries, with opening it up to the multilaterals, to the UN agencies, and most importantly, to partner countries. And this is especially true when we're tackling common or universal challenges. So this brings us to the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition, which is kind of my baby, and my boss sitting here. So the overall purpose of the coalition is very much aligned with the theme of today's discussion. It's all about sharing ideas, knowledge, experiences, and approaches to evaluation. So in addition to having these monthly all coalition meetings, we also establish working groups to support evaluation in key thematic areas. So notably in equitable access to vaccines and in the area of cash transfers and social protection. We also produced and shared guidance notes, technical papers, scoping studies. In early 2020, EvalNet worked with UNDP's IEO on developing a joint guidance note on good practices for evaluation during COVID-19. So these resources, as well as the resources of individual participants, are available on our website and accessible to all of you. So I encourage you to check that out. We also developed an overarching strategic evaluation questions framework. Now, this framework was developed to support coalition participants in evaluating their responses to COVID-19, but it also supports in developing an evidence base that is comparable. Early on in the coalition, we also produced 5 lessons from evaluation summaries. So these notes provided evidence and lessons from the evaluations of multiple different organizations to inform responses during and after the pandemic. So summaries focused on issues such as gender equality, food security, the use of cash transfers, and climate resilience. 3 of them fed into ministerial discussions. And this here is an example of not only collaboration, but of also working under circumstances where you may not be able to make sure something's perfect before going ahead and injecting it into discussions. Finally, the coalition produced a landscaping document to really highlight who's doing what, where, and when. We're actually updating this document right now. And so in sum, for this slide, the coalition allowed participants to learn from each other, and we facilitated that. And that's what we're continuing to do, and to capitalize on each other's experiences and to really do so quickly. So what are the key takeaways here? Significant disruption to business as usual enabled evaluation units to reimagine and demonstrate their utility. Limited travel opportunities prompted critical and constructive thinking about how to work in new partnerships with local evaluation teams. Disruptive changes caused by the pandemic prompted evaluation teams to reconsider how they could use technology and data in more innovative and creative ways. There was an increase in the sharing of information, lessons, best practices across the global evaluation community, which continues to have notable benefits today. And finally, the pandemic demonstrated the role of joint evaluative work and really collaborating and working across evaluations in reducing evaluative burden and in broadening the overall scope. So this brings us to the end of my presentation. I'm really curious and looking forward to hearing about your experiences, your adaptations, whether or not they jive with what you've heard up here today. And if you'd like further information on the coalition, I do encourage you to please come speak to me after the presentation or after the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. And just to let you know, all these presentations will be available, and all the presentations will be available on the eCampus site at the end of each day. So please make sure you're signed up and make sure you know how to use it, and you can get these all of the information that's been presented. So we were going to, or Jenna, sorry, I have a question for you. I mean, you've had an overview of all that has gone on. And in fact, I got an email from your team today asking me to update what UNDP is doing on evaluation in COVID-19. Yeah. But really, one is really resonating. You know, what are you seeing as a trend that EvalNet members and others are going to take forward? You know, beyond maybe a little bit beyond collaboration. Will that continue? But are there certain approaches and tools you feel are standard across the board that may be taken forward?
So I definitely do think that the collaboration will be taken forward, especially as we look at issues such as existential threats. If we look at climate resilience and these types of things, I definitely think there's room for this continued collaboration. But I'll focus on one thing in answering that question in the interest of time. The pandemic really broke a reliance on international consultants, and it raised important questions about the longer term goal of how we look at the roles of international and national evaluators, and how maybe this needs to be rethought. So I think the greater development of national evaluators is something that we will take forward. I think a stronger reliance and looking more at like capacity building opportunities and really emphasizing the benefits of having more local evaluators.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left. I was going to ask the panel a couple of questions, but I think I'm going to throw it out to the audience, if you don't mind, for now, and see. I mean, we've got a lot of experience in the room. We've been through a lot. From the country level, national evaluation systems, how have you responded to the pandemic? How did you change the way you did evaluations, or did you just shelve the process? Would anybody like to reflect on that, please?
Thank you very much to the panelists. My name is Bami. I'm from Botswana Country Office, UNDP. Just to share experiences and insights. Like Richard has indicated, really everything took long, from sourcing evaluators, availability of partners, even the beneficiaries. I mean, it was really a challenge for us to get a hold of these key participants to the evaluation process. And in some cases, the costs were quite high. And and again, as we're communicating with the stakeholders, some of them felt that evaluations were now done more for compliance than what they were actually meant for, because they were in the project document, for example. It meant that, even if we postponed, we still needed to do them. So, but what you also established was that people were not in the right frame of mind at the time. So then this begs the question, can the state of mind of either the evaluator or the beneficiary impact the quality of the evaluation? You talked about the platform, Jenna. You've gathered a lot of insights. So I just wanted to find out if there was any evidence that the state of mind of either the evaluator or the beneficiary could have somehow impacted the quality of the evaluation. Of course, in terms of national experiences, again, what we established in Botswana was that the telecom industry, I think it got a jump start. That's because now people started calling each other by mobile phones, using video calls to get in contact with family. So that was a positive for the entire economy. That's what we established. And of course, the greater use of local experts. There was also a spike in there. So that was also a silver lining from the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. So now, can I ask a question? Yeah. Okay. Right. So I did ask about the mindset of the participants. It'll be interesting to hear that. And also, if any, would you say that there are advantages? Do virtual evaluations have any form of advantage over in-person evaluations? Were you able to gather that evidence? This goes to all panelists. That would be quite interesting to establish. And my last question to Santiago, you talked about triangulation. Now, normally triangulation hinges on the availability of data. Now, at the time, at the height of the pandemic, there wasn't a lot happening. So I'll be interested in how were you able to triangulate? What options did you have to triangulate? Because like I'm saying, there wasn't really a lot happening. So how were you able to triangulate all that data to come to a more informed conclusion? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more and then we'll come back. So I hope you've been taking a few notes. I'll remind you, please, over here.
Maybe I'll start with sharing an experience in terms of some of the, I think, novel practices regarding evaluations that we were involved in. A few staff of the Ministry of Finance and National Planning that coordinates evaluation. I'm coming from Zambia, from the Monitoring and Evaluation Department in the Ministry of Finance and National Planning. My name is Prudence Kaum. We did participate in a global evaluation reference group that was called, it called volunteers to be part of that global reference group to participate in the work that was being done on, I think, assessing the utilization of evaluations by policymakers and how that has worked in several countries. So in terms of I think opportunity, the COVID pandemic provided an opportunity for participation of other people from other countries in this global evaluation work. Had we not had the COVID pandemic, I think there wouldn't have been an opportunity for this cross-sharing of practices and experiences across the globe. So I think that was a positive. So we did see this process as part of the reference group from start to finish, and I think it was very, very enriching. And we had a series of webinars as well as virtual meetings, which sort of helped to, I think, build capacities in people who participated in this reference group. So that's the experience I can share. Then with regard to the discussion we have today, my question goes to Baye. I think regarding the use of, is it big data or mobile data to undertake evaluation? My question is that, well, we recognize actually even in Zambia that this is a resource that is really useful in terms of quickly gathering data to inform the policy making process. I would like to find out in Senegal how this process is legislated, or what is the legal framework that allows for this use of this big data so that the findings are actually validated. Because I think in Zambia, we have a law that gives powers to the National Statistical Office to actually validate what data they think is official and can be actually used to, I think, what's the word? That can be used to be able to, I think, confidently speak about the findings being, I think, applicable across the country. I think it's about data quality and reliability and things like that. So most of the studies that involve use of big data face that challenge in terms of, I think, validity of the data, because I think of the legal framework. Secondly, I think the capacity is also the number of people in country who are actually able to manipulate that data and undertake evaluations or analysis using that big data. If you could speak to that, that would be very useful. Thank you.
I'll take one more question, and we'll take two more questions and then bring it back to the panel. Nargis, and then we'll go over to Sarah.
Thank you. So my question to Mr. Guaye, what was the role of the private sector in gathering the mobile data? And was there any public-private partnership established to collect that data? And finally, if there was any partnership with the private sector, how do you think with this ambitious, plans to engage with the artificial intelligence and, predicting the crises, how do you see the role of the private sector in the evaluation? Thank you.
Thanks, Nargis. One last question, and we'll bring it back to the panel. If we have any more time, we'll come back.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Longford. I'm with World Food Programme, Office of Evaluation. And everything that the panel spoke about has huge resonance with the experience that we had and the evaluation that we undertook. It was a developmental evaluation of WFP's response. And so issues that you mentioned on just the time that it took, the different type of consultation and the sensitivity of and again, gentleman from Botswana also mentioned that it really took a different type of, let's say, evaluator approach with very raw emotions from the people who were being interviewed. It was the first time for many of the WFP colleagues who had stopped from the operations, working very, very long days, and to debrief. And it became very emotional, and therefore the evaluators needed additional training to be able to handle and navigate that. But I just wanted to, one of the things that again, the pandemic brought is, perceptions of much higher risk of not being present and therefore not having the oversight in place to whether it be from audit, whether it be from other risk, we've got a risk division. And therefore, one of the things that we faced was, while there was this need for sort of the lessons to be feeding into the response, there was, again, the sort of the audit needs to be taken care of, the audit perceptions, OEV as officer evaluation, looking at the evaluation, and then the risk colleagues, our executive director had a much higher call to everybody. And so it was disentangling all these different, let's say, requests from central level down to the ground, and therefore some perceptions that there were overlaps between all these different initiatives and how they were sequenced and messaged. So I'm just wondering whether any of the panel had any reflection of how that impacted on any of your work from different, let's say, departments, etc. And then the other one is on cost. There was a perception, again, from our day-to-day managers that it would cost less because we were doing remote. In fact, it took longer and cost more from these additional data collection. So again, we're looking at efficiency at a time, we're a very operational agency looking to save money and give it as direct transfers to citizens, but that again, any reflections from that would be useful.
Thank you. And I'll apologize if we miss any questions, but we have about 8-9 minutes left. So I'm going to go quickly to Santiago because a question directed at you. If you could quickly answer that, and we'll go down and I'll cherry pick some of the key things that were asked.
So thank you for the question. Sorry. Thank you for the question. In fact, yes, data availability is a key assumption. In evaluation at the World Bank, or at least in this experience of the COVID-19 evaluation, we had two levels, project level data and country level data. The World Bank has its own systems of project level data, and we were able to dig into that and collect enough data that we could triangulate. So at the project level, it was comparatively easier. At the country level, could have been harder, but we did find available information on crisis preparedness, levels of vulnerability, and COVID-19 plans guided by the WHO that were either prior or near the onset of COVID-19. So that helped us define the needs of countries around that period, which was the relevant period that we needed. We couldn't track it across time, we could probably, but we could define needs at at the key period of the COVID-19 onset. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would put it. So at project level, easier, country level, perhaps not available data in some elements, but as far as the needs that we need to identify for crisis preparedness, vulnerability, and others, we did find the information that was at the right moment relevant to define needs.
Hi, there were two questions there that would actually, I mean, that they were fascinating. I guess the legitimacy of data that is produced, you know, of course, we have an issue of digital divide. I know a lot of people have mobile phones, but not everybody has mobile phones. So you're not monitoring everybody. So you have a snapshot of a part of the population. So there's a legitimacy of building policy based on data that may not be, you know, fully there. The second point that was made is the legalities. What hoops did you have to jump through to be able to do that? And then the final one, you know, which was related to a couple of questions, is that public-private partnership. How did you get the data?
Merci beaucoup, Richard, et merci pour les questions. C'est des questions très pertinentes et je pense que nous aussi, pendant les travaux, nous avions été confrontés aux difficultés que vous avez soulevées. Et je pense que dans le cadre du Sénégal, il faut comprendre qu'il y a une commission de protection des données qui a été instaurée par loi et qui veille à ce que toutes les structures qui doivent utiliser des données à caractère personnel puissent d'abord en faire la demande. Donc aujourd'hui, la commission est habilitée à valider d'abord la demande de données. Avant même de recevoir, vous devez demander l'aval de cette commission. Ça, c'est en matière législative. Le deuxième souci, et c'est toujours le cas, hein, nous savons qu'il y a beaucoup de faiblesses dans l'utilisation de ces données, mais ça peut donner quand même une perspective, comme vous l'avez vu dans les graphiques, ça peut donner une idée d'un événement brusque qui survient dans une économie où on voit que les déplacements ont tout à fait chuté. Ensuite, sur où est-ce que nous avons obtenu les données, ce que nous vous avons présenté, c'est des données de Google Mobility Report qui utilisent juste la position, mais bien évidemment, Google a cette comment dirais-je, cette obligation d'anonymiser ces données. Donc, nous, on ne connaît pas qui est derrière ces données. Mais notre objectif, c'est maintenant d'utiliser l'opérateur du Sénégal pour voir les personnes qui ont été infectées pendant la COVID, comment ils ont eu les déplacements durant ces périodes et comment on peut mettre en lien ces déplacements avec les clusters que nous avons eus à Dakar dans le cadre de l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle. Et vous avez bien raison de demander ou de poser la question des ressources humaines parce qu'actuellement, au retour de notre mission sur Paris, nous comptons mettre en place au Sénégal un master en data scientist parce qu'on a besoin de ces ressources humaines-là pour développer en tout cas la recherche sur l'intelligence artificielle. Donc, sur la question du secteur privé, pendant la collecte, ils n'étaient pas très impliqués parce que les données sont publiques. On peut les obtenir sur demande. Mais pour l'intelligence artificielle, on aura besoin des compétences du secteur privé. Quand nous sommes partis en France, on a rencontré le hub IA France et c'est des acteurs qui sont dans le secteur privé et qui proposent des solutions au gouvernement, aux États pour leur permettre d'avoir des KPIs sur certains indicateurs clés qu'ils veulent suivre sur leur politique publique. Donc, voilà rapidement ce que je voulais répondre. Merci et merci à vous.
Thanks, Bart. That's fascinating insight. And I guess, you know, those are things we need to square away if we're going to use this data going forward. Ben, you raised an interesting point that I'd never, ever thought about. And, you know, now I'm somewhat ashamed that I had not thought about it. And I'm going to throw that to Jenna. And that's the whole idea of mindset. And I think it relates somewhat to what Sarah said as well. About, you know, let's remember it was a very tough time, you know, March to June, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Yet we still, UNDP alone managed to do about 70 evaluations during that time. Now, evaluators are struggling. They're going things, we as managers were struggling, and then we're interviewing people who are also struggling. So it was a very different atmosphere to the first 3 months of the year. So sorry to put this on you, Jenna, but I think it is a question for the panel and also for the room. Did this come out in the work of the coalition? And just that, maybe a last question there is, what, and we can talk in general over coffee about, are there benefits to virtual evaluations, or is there, I mean, we talk about it taking longer, but you know, we can discuss that as well. So sorry to throw that to you, Jenna.
I feel a bit ashamed as well, and I don't have an answer to that question, unfortunately. I wish I did. My initial instinct is to say yes. I think it must have. I think back to when in Canada with the government of Canada, we went home one night and then I didn't go back into the office for 2 years. So your whole world is turned upside down. I was working, you know, from the kitchen table with my 3 kids as I homeschooled them. So to say that that didn't have an impact on me or my ability to work, I think I would be lying. With respect to beneficiaries, I think it would be the same thing. They're living this whole new reality. They're experiencing these whole new experiences, and that's impacting them. It definitely did. But do I have anything other than my experience and my perceptions? No. But I do think that that's something that would be worth looking into and studying more. With respect to your question about remote evaluations, I think, you know, at the onset of the pandemic, I was working on an evaluation and I was set to travel extensively to 6 different countries in the Asia Pacific region. And this was all done remotely. I think there were a number of cons, but I do think that there were a few pros. I mean, first of all, there's the cost. And then there's also the fact that we significantly reduced our environmental footprint, which I think is important, and that has benefits for everyone. The other thing is with virtual interviews, we did conduct interviews with a number of different people from vulnerable populations who actually shared with me that this was much more comfortable for them to be able to talk about these sensitive topics and to be able to do so from the comfort of their own homes. So beyond that, I'm not entirely sure, but that's kind of my experience.
Thank you, Jenna. So you know I'm a stickler for time, and I got to get you back to the coffee so that I can get you back into the next one. And it'd be remiss of me of not to be the one who lived by his own rules. So I'm going to bring it to an end there, but maybe we can take some of these conversations back to the coffee break. There's a ton of questions I had here for the panel and you, which I never got to. And so let's just please take them away. I mean, for me, has evaluation adapted enough to the challenges of the pandemic, right? This question, I think we heard this morning from Indran that we failed. I think from others we hear, well, we did step up. Another question that maybe isn't asked enough is, has the use of evaluation changed due to the pandemic? And we talked a lot there, Jenna and others, about, you know, we changed our approach to try and be maybe not quick and dirty, but you know, we were less, we didn't let perfection get in the way of good, right? We were pumping things out and we were working hard, which is probably why after 2 years we're all burnt out a little bit as well. So maybe we can take that back to the group and the coffee and follow up with those conversations. But otherwise, Santiago, bye, Jenna, please, thank you very much. And thank you all for your questions and your patience.